In 1991, two of the biggest names in electronics stood on a stage together and announced a new console. One day later, one of them canceled it. Live, from that same stage, Nintendo made that call. It would turn out to be the most expensive mistake the company ever made. Because the partner it walked away from didn't walk away from the idea. A working prototype already existed. Almost every copy was destroyed. One survived, through a bankruptcy, an attic outside Philadelphia, and 25 years of nobody noticing. It sold in 2020 for $360,000, according to Heritage Auctions. This is the story of what Nintendo gave up, and what Sony built instead. This is the history of PlayStation. And my video includes a lawsuit over a vibrating gamepad that almost got PlayStation banned from sale in the United States. It includes a hack that exposed data from 77 million accounts, according to Sony's own count. It includes a rival console that launched itself on stage without warning a single store. All of that is coming. And to understand exactly what got handed away, you have to go back to where this actually started. Not on that stage. Earlier. 1988. Tokyo and Kyoto. Two companies, one shared idea. Leading the push, on Nintendo's side, company president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nintendo and Sony agreed to build a CD drive for the Super Nintendo. Working title, PlayStation, also called Super Disc. Under the terms, Sony became the sole worldwide licensor of the format. That meant Sony controlled which games got approved and controlled the profit from every disc sold. Nobody's ever found the exact date this got signed, or the names on the page. But the terms themselves are well documented. And they're the whole point. Nintendo handed over control of its own future format. They already had it. In my view, that's the most quietly reckless clause in this whole story. A company hands away control of its own next format and calls it a partnership. Nobody has ever produced the actual signed contract. Only the terms survive, and what those terms triggered 3 years later. Because somebody inside Sony was already building the machine that would make this deal matter at all. That engineer was Ken Kutaragi. In the late 1980s, working inside Sony's own research labs, he built something nobody asked him to build. The story goes that he got the idea watching his own daughter play a Nintendo console at home. So he designed a sound chip for the Super Nintendo, entirely in secret. Sony, at the time, was a company built on stereos and television sets, not video games. He wasn't authorized to do any of this. That chip ended up inside the console anyway, credited to Sony as a supplier. When his bosses found out about the secrecy, they were furious. By most accounts, his job was genuinely on the line, and yet Sony's president, Norio Oga, personally stepped in and let the project continue. Furious enough to end a career, protected enough to survive it. Both of these are true. In my view, this is the moment the whole story actually pivots, not the deal itself. This decision, right here, one executive chose to protect one engineer, instead of firing him for building a toy on company time. That single choice is the reason any of this got built at all. 3 years later, the two companies were standing on the same convention stage again, except this time, the whole industry was watching. May 28, 1991. Not Las Vegas. Not January either. That's a mix-up you'll see repeated all over the internet. This was the summer trade show held in Chicago. Sony and Nintendo stood together and announced a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. On a table nearby sat the actual hardware. Picture a gray console, shaped like the Super Nintendo itself, a cartridge slot on top, a CD tray built into the front, and on that same gray case, two logos, side by side, Nintendo and Sony. Nobody in that room believed anything was about to go wrong. Reporters photographed the handshake. Executives from both companies smiled for the cameras. For one afternoon, it looked like a partnership built to last decades. 24 hours later, that same photograph would look almost cruel. May 29th. Same stage, same room. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had already decided the deal was over. He'd sent two of his own people, Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, to quietly negotiate with Philips instead. Sony's man in the audience, Olaf Olafsson, hadn't been warned. He found out live, in front of everyone, from the stage. The Seattle Times had actually reported the switch 2 days earlier. Nobody at Sony seems to have read it. To me, that's the detail that stings, not the betrayal itself. The fact that Sony was the last to know about its own ending. 18 months later, Sony made its answer official. November 16, 1993. Sony Computer Entertainment is founded as its own company. Kutaragi reportedly told Oga the snub was unforgivable, and that argument won. By then, the joint prototypes, maybe 200 of them by one estimate, had mostly been destroyed. One gray case, with both logos still on it, would somehow survive anyway. Nintendo had walked away owning the whole idea. Sony walked away building it alone. That new company needed a president. Not Kutaragi, at least not yet. Sony Computer Entertainment's first president was Toshio Ozawa, from November 1993 until March 1995. Teruhisa Tokunaka took over after that, starting in April. Kutaragi himself wouldn't become deputy president until October 1996. He wouldn't run the company outright until April 1999. Most retellings skip straight past both of those men and hand Kutaragi the whole story. It's a bit like crediting a company's founding to its chief engineer. Meanwhile, someone else's signature was actually on the paperwork. Neither Ozawa nor Tokunaka gets remembered for this. Kutaragi does. In my view, that's the part popular retellings always get wrong. It's a cleaner story, with one hero and one villain. The real one has two unnamed presidents quietly running the company in between. None of that changes what happened next. Sony still had a console to actually sell. I get why the simpler version spreads. One name is easier to remember than three. But easier isn't the same as accurate. December 3, 1994, Tokyo. Sony's own console finally goes on sale. The price? 39,800 yen. No Nintendo logo anywhere on the box this time. Just Sony's name, alone, on something it had built entirely by itself. The console that Nintendo once controlled the format for now belonged to nobody but Sony. The price was set deliberately low, undercutting rivals in Japan to grab market share fast. For the first time, this was a machine that owed nothing to that old, broken deal. 39,800 yen doesn't mean much as a number on its own. Back then, that was roughly a week's salary for an entry-level worker in Japan, or the price of a decent bicycle. Either way, it was a console priced to move fast, not to sit on shelves. Sony wasn't trying to make a profit on day one. It was trying to make sure everyone in Japan noticed. 6 months later, the real fight wouldn't be in Tokyo at all. It would happen on a stage in Los Angeles. May 11, 1995. The E3 trade show in Los Angeles. Sega's American president, Tom Kalinske, walked on stage and announced something nobody expected. Sega Saturn was on sale immediately, for $399, not in a few months. That day, Sega had already quietly shipped units to a handful of chosen retailers. Toys R Us and a few specialty chains were among them. Big retailers like Walmart weren't even told. For Sega, this was supposed to be the story of the day. A win nobody could ignore. The surprise landed exactly as planned. The demo worked. A few hours later, Sony got its turn. Steve Race, president of Sony Computer Entertainment America, walked out to the microphone. He said exactly one word: $299. Then he walked off stage, before the applause even finished. By some accounts, that price wasn't locked in until the night before. To me, the interesting part isn't the surprise itself. Sega's surprise was aimed at retailers. Sony's surprise was aimed straight at Sega's price tag. Then the price dropped. September 9th, 1995. The United States. $299. Now actually on shelves. For the first time, you could actually walk into a store and buy one. 20 days later, September 29th, Europe got its own launch. £299 there. It didn't matter which side of the Atlantic you were on, the number felt the same. 2 markets, 1 price point, 0 involvement from the company that once controlled this whole idea. May 19, 2004. Sony's own press release put it plainly. More than 100 million PlayStation and PS1 units shipped worldwide, combined. By the time production actually ended, in March 2006, the number had grown. Estimates put the real total closer to 102 million. Compare that to the batch of maybe 200 prototypes Nintendo once built back in 1991. Most of those were destroyed. One survived, in a gray case, with both logos still on it. 200 versus 100 million. 200 prototypes, 100 million consoles. That gap is the entire argument of this chapter. In 2 numbers. Nintendo held the smaller one. Sony ended up holding the larger one, alone, because Nintendo let go first. This wasn't the end of the story, though. It wasn't even close. The technology that made PlayStation possible was about to get a sequel. And that sequel would need a chip powerful enough to worry an entire industry. It would start with the loudest rival Sony had left. That's a different fight entirely. And it starts with a number even bigger than 299. That new number belonged to a chip. Immersion engine. Sony and Toshiba announced it in March 1999 at a chip conference in San Francisco called ISSE. Sony called it the first true 128-bit processor built for a game console. A few days later, on March 4th, Toshiba made it official in a separate press release, a joint venture. 51% Toshiba, 49% Sony Computer Entertainment. A whole factory, in Oita Prefecture, built specifically to produce this chip. 10,000 silicon wafers a month, right out of the gate. Trade press outlets covered it, like a genuine industry event, not just another spec sheet. I'll be honest, that number stopped me for a second. 10,000 wafers a month is not a toy company's investment. That's closer to what a car manufacturer commits to a single new model. Nobody builds that kind of factory for a niche product. Sony wasn't hedging here. This wasn't a side bet anymore. You don't commit that kind of money unless you're certain the demand will follow. The real question was whether anyone would actually buy the thing built around all of it. March 4th, 2000. Japan. PlayStation 2 goes on sale. 39,800 yen. Roughly $372 at the time. About 1 million units were ready at launch. All of them sold out over that first weekend. There were reports of actual crowds outside stores in Tokyo. People lined up before dawn. All for a machine built around a chip nobody outside the industry had even heard of. October 26, 2000. The United States gets its turn. Same price tag as before. $299. The line outside every store that week says more than any sales chart could. This wasn't a machine tied to somebody else's console anymore. Nobody lines up overnight for an accessory. People were lining up for something Sony now owned outright, top to bottom. That kind of demand, though, comes with its own kind of attention. Success, it turns out, makes you a target in ways failure never does. Not just from customers, from lawyers too. February 2002. Immersion Corporation files a lawsuit against Sony. The claim, patent infringement, over the vibration motors inside PlayStation controllers. Force feedback, in industry terms. It took over 2 years to reach a jury. September 2004. The verdict comes back. Sony infringed on 2 of Immersion's patents. The jury's number, $82 million, for something most people assumed Sony had invented outright. Not a settlement, not a fine. A verdict, straight from a jury, over a rumble pack most players never thought twice about. That verdict wasn't the end of it either. March 2006. A district court added interest and legal costs on top of the original number. The total climbed to $90.7 million. Sony then lost its appeal, and that loss opened the door to something much bigger than money. A real, functioning threat. An injunction that could have pulled PlayStation and PlayStation 2 off shelves across the entire United States. Every store shelf, every warehouse, potentially every unit already on its way to a retailer. March 1st, 2007. Sony and Immersion settle. The core payment, $97.2 million. The court judgment plus interest. On top of that, $22.5 million in licensing fees, running through 2009. Add in royalties Sony was already paying. Before any of this. One outlet, Law 360, put the full running total at over $150 million. 4 different numbers, 4 different points in this same case. Sony lost this fight in court. Sony also walked away from it still standing, still shipping consoles. Both of these are true. April 15, 2008. DualShock 3 finally launches in the United States, vibration motors included. That's more than a year after PlayStation 3 itself hit shelves, back in November 2006, without any vibration at all. That controller had a different name for a reason. 6-axis. No rumble. On purpose, because of this exact lawsuit. So the console people actually held in 2006 was already shaped by this fight. Most of them never even knew it happened. That's not where the risk-taking in this next chapter ends either. I'll be honest, this whole case is a good example of why you shouldn't trust a single number in isolation. 82 million, 90.7 million, 97.2 million, 150 million, or more, depending who's counting. 4 figures, 1 lawsuit, 4 different moments in time. None of them is wrong. None of them is the whole story either, without a date attached to it. And Sony was about to make a bet that made this entire legal mess look small. So that's Chapter 3, in 2 numbers and 1 lawsuit. A console that sold in the tens of millions. A legal fight that almost erased all of it overnight. Sony survived both. But surviving a threat from the outside is one thing. The next part of this story is about a different kind of risk. One Sony chose for itself, on purpose, with its own money, on a chip nobody else in the industry was willing to build. That bet had a name too. Cell. March 2001. Sony, IBM, and Toshiba announce an alliance. The plan, 5 years, 1 shared processor. Built from scratch. They called it Cell. According to industry estimates, developing it cost around $400 million, split roughly evenly across the 3 companies. Sony never confirmed that number itself. Nobody officially has. But even as an estimate, it tells you something. This wasn't a chip for one product. This was infrastructure, built to outlast whatever console eventually carried it. I'll be honest. The architecture itself is the part that always gets me. Cell wasn't one simple processor. It was one main core, plus 8 separate specialized ones, all needing to be managed by hand. Developers compared it to something else entirely, handing regular drivers the keys to a Formula One car. All that power, sure, but almost nobody actually knew how to drive it well. Sony knew this going in. It shipped anyway. November 11th, 2006. Japan. November 17th, the United States. PlayStation 3 finally launches, built around that same chip. 2 versions at launch in the US. $499 for the 20GB model. $599 for the 60GB version. In Japan, the smaller model had a fixed price too, 59,800 yen. The bigger one was left to retailers to price on their own. Either way, this was Sony's most expensive console launch yet, by a wide margin. A teardown by the research firm iSupply that same November put actual numbers on the damage. The 60GB model cost Sony around $840 to build. It sold for $599. That's a loss of roughly $241 on every single unit. The cheaper model was worse. Around $806 to build, sold for $499. A loss closer to $307 each. It's a bit like selling a car for less than the parts cost, and hoping to make the difference back on oil changes. Add it all up across an entire fiscal year, the one ending in March 2007. Sony's game division reported an operating loss of roughly $1.97 billion. Not from one bad decision, from millions of consoles, each one sold at a loss, on purpose, as a bet on the future. That bet would eventually pay off, but before it did, Sony's reputation would take one more hit. This one wouldn't come from a chip or a price tag. It would come from outside the company entirely. April 17th through the 19th, 2011. Someone breaks into Sony's servers. April 20th. PlayStation Network just goes dark. No explanation given, not yet. 2 days later, Sony finally confirms it. An external intrusion. April 26th. The full admission comes. Personal data, potentially stolen, tied to every account on the network. By early May, the number solidifies. 77 million PlayStation Network and Curiosity accounts. Compromised. Names, home addresses, emails, birth dates, login credentials, hashed, but still exposed. None of this showed up as a photograph or a leaked screenshot circulating anywhere. It showed up as a number, climbing on a screen. And that first number wasn't even the full picture. May 2nd and 3rd, 2011. Sony announces a second, separate breach, this time in Sony Online Entertainment. Another 24.6 million accounts exposed. Add that to the first number, and the real total crosses 100 million. To me, 77 million was never the whole story here. It was less than half of it. PlayStation Network stayed down for 23 days. Sony later estimated the cleanup cost at $171 million. Regulators in the UK fined the company £250,000. Sony was, genuinely, a victim here. Somebody broke in from outside. Sony was also, genuinely, responsible for how long its own systems stayed exposed. Both of these are true. So that's the arc of this chapter. A chip almost nobody could program. A console sold at a loss. A breach that took weeks to even describe properly. Sony survived all three, technically. But survival isn't the same as an unblemished record. What comes next is a different kind of story. Not a crisis forced on Sony from outside. A product that was actually better than its rival, and still lost. December 17, 2011. Japan gets it first. February 22, 2012. The rest of the world catches up. PlayStation Vita. A 5-inch OLED screen, sharper than almost anything else on the market at the time. And for the first time ever, on a portable PlayStation, 2 full analog sticks instead of 1. On paper, this was the strongest handheld Sony had ever built. It launched at $249 in the West, 24,980 yen in Japan. None of that saved it. Sony badly underestimated smartphones as competition, treating mobile games as something not quite serious enough to worry about. The memory cards were proprietary and expensive, which frustrated people immediately. Major publishers thinned their support within a couple of years. And the timing was rough. Vita arrived late in the PS3 era, and PS4 was already on the horizon, coming in November 2013. A genuinely strong piece of hardware, undercut by almost everything around it. Here's a strange detail worth sitting with. Sony has released a launch window number for every single PlayStation console, going back to the original in '94. Every one, except this one. Vita's last official figure was around 4 million units, back in December 2012. After that, silence. Analysts eventually settled on a rough estimate, around 16 million units total, by 2018. Production quietly ended March 1, 2019. The best-designed handheld in the lineup is also the only one without a final number. Nobody in the company ever bothered to say it out loud. Late 2024. On an official PlayStation podcast, the head of the brand, Jim Ryan, finally says a number out loud. PlayStation 2 sold over 160 million units total. That confirmation came 12 years after the last official figure. Sony had said 155 million back in 2012, and then just stopped talking about it. 12 years of silence on the best-selling console the company has ever made. By then, Nintendo Switch was closing in on that same record, which may be exactly why Sony finally spoke up. I'll be honest, that gap says something. Even Sony's own biggest record sat unconfirmed for over a decade. If a company can't put a final number on its greatest success, you have to wonder what else in this story never got a clean number attached to it. There's one answer sitting in a house in Philadelphia, not a metaphor, an actual, physical object. The one Nintendo built, the one Sony grew out of, on purpose or otherwise. 2015, Philadelphia. Dan Diebold is going through his father's belongings and finds something strange. A gray console, shaped roughly like a Super Nintendo. A cartridge slot on top. A CD tray built into the front. And on that same case, two logos, side by side. Nintendo and Sony. This exact object had once belonged to Olof Olofsson. He's the man who learned about the Philips deal live, in that CES crowd back in '91. When his office closed, his things went to storage at a company called Advanta Corporation. Advanta went bankrupt, November 8, 2009. Dan's father, Terry, had won a random lot at Advanta's liquidation auction, about $75, with no idea what was actually inside. An engineer named Ben Heck later confirmed it was real and that it still worked. From a Sony executive's office, to a bankrupt company's warehouse, to a cardboard box nobody bothered to open for years. That's the actual path this thing took. Not a museum, not a vault, a random liquidation lot. For 25 years, people in the game industry talked about this device like it was a legend, closer to myth than to a real object. It was neither lost nor mythical. It was just misfiled. March 6, 2020. Heritage Auctions puts it up for sale, publicly, for the first time ever. 57 bids later, the hammer falls at $300,000. With the buyer's premium added on, the final total comes to $360,000. The winning bidder, Greg McLemore, the founder of Pets.com and Toys.com. A device that once sat, forgotten, in a random storage unit. It sold for more than most people make in several years combined. For 5 years, that sale looked like the end of the story. The one surviving prototype, found, sold, documented, case closed. Then, in 2026, the National Video Game Museum announced something else. By one report, still unconfirmed as of this telling, a second prototype had surfaced. People are already calling it Sony MSF1. If that holds up, the word "only" stops being true. There may never have been just one artifact proving what this whole story cost. Nintendo built the format everyone eventually wanted. They already had it. So here's where this actually leaves off. Not with a loss, with an open file. 1988, a deal that handed away the future. 1991, a partnership canceled one day after it was announced. 1994, a console launched entirely alone. 1995, a single word worth $100. A lawsuit over a shaking controller that almost got products pulled from an entire country. A chip so complex it needed its own manual. A hack that touched over 100 million people. A handheld that deserved better than it got. And 2 boxes, found 11 years apart, both claiming to be the only one. Nintendo made one mistake. In 1991, nobody has finished counting what it actually cost. If you remember the first PlayStation you ever held, tell me about it in the comments. Genuinely curious. Subscribe if you want the full story of that vibrating controller lawsuit next. Somewhere, there might be a third box. For now, that's exactly where we leave it.